Our moderator, Tatiana Torres, Vice President of Public Affairs at SKDK, and our esteemed panel.
Good afternoon. Buenas tardes, as they say in my country. I am extremely honored and happy to be here with you all today with this amazing panel, and also to celebrate the victory of the Supreme Court Justice Brown Jackson as well. So with me today, we have some wonderful guests, and I'd like to introduce you to them briefly. With me is Henry Charles II. He's the Chief Fund Manager at the Business Consortium Fund. Virtually with us today, we have Tracy Palandjian, CEO and co-founder of Social Finance, and Dr. Aaron Thompson, President of the Kentucky Council on Post-Secondary Education. Please give them a round of applause. A study by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York found that at the height of the pandemic, Black-owned businesses were nearly 2 times likely to close than white owners. 32% of Latino businesses and 26% of AAPI businesses shuttered during 2020. Accessibility to capital, impacts on education, on women and childcare, and new opportunities, and the word that everyone used during the pandemic, the pivot points of how individuals could thrive and could move forward post the impacts of the pandemic, or just some of the issues and problems that have impacted the growth and the opportunity for those to move forward. I have a few questions this afternoon for some of our esteemed panelists, and also from the audience as well. Dr. Thompson, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Tatiana.
Absolutely. So, I wanted to talk a little bit about your work in education. What systemic changes do you find or that you see that are needed in order for us to thrive and change? What are some of the challenges that you've seen, and what are some of the options and growths that we could have or impact that we can have in this area of education?
Thank you, great question. It's what I call the squeeze effect. And let me start with our first big North Star. We know we have to have 60% of all of our Kentuckians with a credential that matters. And I want to put this in perspective. This is what we know, that for us to have a thriving economy, we have to be able to have a highly educated workforce. For us to have a highly educated workforce, we have to have a strong higher education system and a pipeline that leads to that. Right now, as an example, we only have about 50% of our students graduating from high school going into college. And what I mean by college, not just a 4-year degree, but any of our technical certifications, all of those items, they kind of fall under me, as well as the 4-year baccalaureate and professional degrees and graduate degrees. We know we need it all to reach this. What we also know is that we can't leave anybody behind. So if we're going to do what we need to do to build a quality workforce, we cannot leave our minoritized population behind. We can't leave our low-income people behind. Can't do all of that. That's part of the squeeze, and that's part of the solution. The other part is we've got to get employers engaged with us on the front end to help us to design those programs that they need 5-10 years from now, not just wait until we actually educate the students and then try to re-educate them. So the squeeze effect is we need to bring the pipeline together in such a manner that we do that. And I'm proud to say Kentucky, we're closing gaps fast in that area. We've increased in the last few years those credentials that matter about 17.5%, and for our minoritized populations, 37%. So this is exactly the way we are approaching that. The pandemic has slowed us down a little bit, but because we were doing the front end, it didn't slow us down as much as other states. Our enrollment's down, for an example, but it's not down as much. And our students of color, we're up significantly and the only groups with our Latinx and African American students leading the way. So that's what we have to do, and that's how we have to think about it, not just now, but we're going to have to continue to think about it as we build that pipeline.
Thank you. So speaking of pipeline, Tracy, what are some of the initiatives that social finance is working on that strengthen this pipeline, the social progress, to be able to empower folks to move forward?
Thank you, Tatiana. It's great to be with you all. I love how Dr. Thompson started this conversation, talk about the squeeze, right? And it's wonderful to have Henry here too, because Dr. Thompson's thinking about the education and training institutions to deliver that talent. And then businesses are on the other side catching this talent, and they're facing just unprecedented labor shortages around the country. I think the last count from the Bureau of Labor Statistics nationally is that it's almost 11 million job openings around the country, right? So what an exciting time to think about building new pipes to connect the supply and demand of talent with the new models that we are developing. I always say that this is not just a time that people are looking for jobs, it's jobs looking for people. So what are the challenges and the frictions in this middle piece that is not making the supply and demand work smoothly? We know that there are great programs out there. Aaron mentioned some non-4-year degrees, whether it's a short-term credentialing program in IT or the skilled trades or advanced manufacturing. There are just lots of great opportunity outcomes-focused programs that can deliver people from a low-wage situation into a middle wage and middle skills job arena where there's also a pathway to continued upward mobility. And yet, if you're outside of the Title IV system and you cannot access Pell Grants, low-income individuals have a really hard time financing their own upskilling journey. And this is where we come in. And I'll give you a specific example. A month ago, we launched a $100 million program with Google. Google balance sheet and their .org, their philanthropic arm, gave us $100 million to design a program to upskill 20,000 Americans without college degrees to over the next 10-year period, which is the fund's duration, to achieve over $1 billion in aggregate income gains across the board. How are we going to do that? Low-income individuals can enroll in Google Certificates program and importantly get wraparound support services like emergency aid funds to meet childcare, transportation, and rent, extra job coaching support, caseworker support. Typically, these programs are 4 to 6 months in length. Our inaugural training partners are Merit America and Year Up. So these individuals get to enroll in these high-quality programs at no upfront cost. And if and only if they get a job that pays over $40,000 a year, they would make $100, around $100 payment a month back into the program, only to cover the cost of the program at no interest. And at any given point in time, they drop out of the labor force or they don't get a job at all, they owe nothing. We call this mechanism the Career Impact Bond, and that's one example of how we're solving for the financial barrier facing a lot of low-income Americans.
I love that. Jobs looking for people. That's something that's going to stick with me. I think that's important. And we had an earlier discussion today around that topic as well, and empowering women and folks of color and those in underserved rural areas as well to attain that. So thank you, Tracy. Henry.
Yes.
So reflecting on your time as the National Director for the U.S. Department of Commerce Minority Business Development Agency, what public policy and actions did you take, must be taken post-COVID that impact the lives of many individuals that could make recovery accessible and equitable?
So in order for there to be an equitable recovery, there has to be an equitable distribution of capital. If you just go back to the beginning of the pandemic, of the $2 trillion that was allocated for recovery with the first CARES Act, only $10 million was carved out for minority-owned businesses. 10 million out of 2 trillion. If you look at the private sector, 2021 was a record year for venture capital fundraising. Over $300 billion raised in venture capital last year. Less than 1% of that went to Black founders. So, I mean, we want to talk about an equitable recovery, but we need an equitable distribution of capital. So you asked me about policy. You know, let's just talk about economic development for a second, right? I love economic development. But unfortunately, the way it's practiced now is what happens is we use these tax incentives to lure outside companies in. And what happens is rents go up, and then the local businesses and the local residents end up getting priced out. It leads to homelessness, income inequality, and more segregated neighborhoods. Look at Austin, look at San Francisco. So what we want to do is we're disrupting economic development by making business development the core of economic development. We invest in the businesses that are already in these communities. Over the past 2 years, we launched 2 private equity funds that have raised $150 million to invest in minority-owned businesses.
Fantastic.
Because what we really need is we need some gigantic minority businesses.
Absolutely.
We need some Black Teslas, and we need some Hispanic Googles. That's how you create economic growth. That's how you close the racial wealth gap, and that's how you create an equitable recovery.
That's true. Thank you. So we know that partnerships are important. We talk about P3s all the time and why partnerships are good in our communities, but it's also the community piece and local community is a key component to economic recovery post-COVID. So government, the business community, I dare say the philanthropic community as well, should be part of this conversation and work together, as you just mentioned, to be able to work with underserved communities and elevate their platform. So for the 3 of you, and Tracy, I'd like to start with you, and then Aaron, and then Henry. So why is it important that businesses, government, philanthropy, and even faith groups partner together in order to see an actual, really important change in what systemically we've seen in recovery?
I love that question, Tatiana, and I'll give a real example to illustrate the power of P3. We're now working in around half a dozen states, and I'll give you the example in New Jersey, and we hope to come to Kentucky and see what you all need there. But the governor of New Jersey said, okay, I have a particular economic development agenda, particular industries of the future, if you will, that will drive the state's economy, yet my current talent system is not delivering the skills to support the kind of industries of the future. So how do I marry my workforce development agenda with my economic development agenda so that we have the right skills and the workers of the future to fulfill the aims of the state economically? So we designed a fund called the Pay It Forward Fund, where we aggregated public dollars, maybe even some American Rescue Plan dollars that New Jersey got, plus annual workforce development dollars. This is now money that the state spends every year. They grant it out to individuals, and the next year they have to come up with a new pot of money and spend it again. So we married public money with corporate contributions from the largest employers in New Jersey, Merck, J&J, Prudential, you name it, and created a pot of capital to upskill low-income New Jerseyans to get these skills to meet the needs of the future. And the successful worker, just like the way I described the Google mechanism, would repay just the cost of the program back into the fund, and those proceeds would then train the next cohort of students, so it just continued to recycle into the future to train more people. We're really excited about the power of this, both in terms of the outcomes nature of the mechanism, because only successful people repay, and also because you can really stretch the impact per dollar being spent.
Thank you. Aaron, would you like to answer the same question from an education
I
perspective?
would, but I'm going to answer it from 2 perspectives. One is the head of higher education for Kentucky. The other is from a sociologist with a background in organizational behavior and race and gender inequality.
Very good.
So from a higher ed perspective, we have to have economic development, workforce development, private employers, and higher education coming in together, creating a strategic process for the longer term output that we really want, right? It's not just going to happen overnight. You can put money into the system and still not get the outcomes you want. So you have to systematically approach this to attract employers, no doubt, but make sure we have the workforce that they need, that they want, and that we can keep building that. Now, from a sociological viewpoint, I will say this, that when you start thinking about wealth, let's forget about income for a second. When you start thinking about wealth, there's a lot of inputs there. I call it equity. I mean, you have to really build that entrepreneurial mindset. You have to build the process of understanding how you save and invest, how you reinvest your business dollars in a manner that actually gets you a bigger return. How people can get involved in that comes all the way from every societal element that you name, from our religious groups, from our local community folk, from the P-12 education system and higher ed, and I keep on going with that. This is what we know that's been lacking forever in building out what we needed to build out with our low-income people as well as with our minoritized communities. So once again, I'm gonna call it the squeeze effect. When you think about it systematically, you have to systematically approach it from each end. But in that, I'm an educator, I'm gonna say this, in that there's a whole element of the different kinds of educational inputs that you have to make and make sure that no one's left behind in those educational inputs, right? And we see that, even if it's talking about gifted education in P-12, or if you're talking about people going into certain wealth building positions or educational majors. I mean, so all of that has to come together.
Thank you, Aaron. Henry?
Yeah, so for me, it's all about the future. I mean, we are witnessing history's fastest rate of transformation ever. I mean, the fourth industrial revolution is unlike anything we have ever witnessed in the past. We're talking about nanotechnology, biotechnology, augmented reality, virtual reality, AI, energy storage, blockchain. And we're seeing the effects that it's having. And a lot of people come up to me like, oh, Henry, don't be dramatic. We've been through these revolutions before, we'll be fine. But this fourth industrial revolution is unlike the other revolutions in two distinct ways: speed and intelligence. Because in the past, these revolutions could take up to 50 years, right? So if you miss the first 2 years, you're okay. You still have time to catch up. Now, these waves of innovation are happening every 18 to 24 months. So if you miss the first 2 years, you miss the wave. And then intelligence, the past, it was all about industrialized labor, right? Now it's about industrialized intelligence. It's about hybrid thinking, merging the man with the machine. So the reason why that's important, and you ask why we need all hands on deck, just look at a technology like cryptocurrencies, right? Cryptocurrency has the fastest rate of adoption of any technology in the history of mankind. And we still have people that don't even understand the basics of blockchain.
It's very true.
These things are moving at light speed. So my fear is, especially for minority communities, we missed out on the first industrial revolution and we got left behind. We missed out on the second and the third industrial revolutions and we got left behind. We cannot miss out on this fourth industrial revolution because there will be no catching up. Because make no mistake, the machines aren't coming.
Yeah.
They're here.
Right. So to close, there is a question from the audience that I think ties in with what you just said. So the equitable distribution of capital was mentioned earlier. What are some other critical policies? And we only have 1 minute, so just try to answer that in 1 minute.
1 minute, it's simple. It's all about wealth.
Okay.
It's all about wealth. We know that 85% of the wealth in the United States is in the hands of white households. How do you get capital to move from places it historically doesn't go?
Ready to close the racial wealth gap.
And to close the racial wealth gap.
That's right. Well, thank you very much for joining. Henry, I appreciate that. Aaron, Tracy, thank you for being with us today. We appreciate your comments and your thoughts, and we look forward to connecting soon. And please reach out to these wonderful panelists through their social media networks as well. Thank you for the opportunity this afternoon.